Thank you, Carmen, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm Melanie Kohls. I'm the outreach specialist with the WICDI project. And today's session is going to be a panel. So you'll be hearing some updates from us about the WICDI project and what we've been working on. And then you'll also hear updates from several panelists. And we will cover a lot of different ground to see what people have been working on over the past several months. So as I said, I'm Melanie Kohls. I do a lot of the development of the community of practice for the WICDI project. I send a lot of emails and help to put together presentations for things like this. So you may have run into me in the past, virtually or in person. And I also have two of my colleagues with me today, Genevieve and Emma, so I'll give them a chance to introduce themselves now.
Hi, my name is Genevieve Burgess. I work alongside Melanie as the research specialist for this project. I've been aboard this project for about 6 months now, and I absolutely love it. Emma?
Hi, I'm Emma Cutler. I am the NOAA Coastal Management Fellow, and I'm working with the Wisconsin Coastal Management Program. And primarily, I've been working with the WICDI project to do culvert vulnerability assessments. So I'll be talking about some updates related to that.
Thanks, guys. And if I didn't mention right at the start, WICDI stands for Wisconsin Coastal Management Data Infrastructure. And we've been working on building a community of practice in the northern Lake Superior counties of Wisconsin. So that's Ashland, Douglas, Iron, and Bayfield counties, focusing on flood resiliency and data management through culvert data inventories. So we've been working a lot with different people in that area who have either culvert inventories that they do a lot of work with or are looking to get started on, things like that. So the focus of our session today will be culverts and all things related to culverts. So I'm going to advance the slides.
So in late January, we had our second community of practice workshop. And following that, we created the master list of attributes for our potential master list of attributes. And from like all the submitted data and previously collected data, there were about 80 fields. And like following that, we created another master list that our COP could add to, and they could add like the different attributes that they saw, that they didn't see that we already had. And after that, our list grew to 160 fields, so it basically doubled. And once we had that, we were able to create our survey to send out to all of the community of practice. And the basic thing that we wanted for that is we wanted them to be able to rank each attribute by its usefulness into core, useful, and not useful. And by that, we wanted to make it kind of easy for them to just have things in manageable chunks. So instead of having it as one long list, we had it in a shorter list for them to each be able to see. Do you have anything to add to that, Melanie?
Not too much. I think I can go ahead and talk a little bit about how we processed the survey results. So we had 23 people respond to the survey, which was pretty impressive to us because it was quite a long survey. So thank you to anyone who responded. And we tried to sort the respondents into broad categories based on what type of organization they came from or represented. So we got roughly 5 and 5 each of asset management and people working with hydrologic data. And then we had quite a few people working with more ecological data, so more from an environmental perspective. And then we had Wisconsin Emergency Management also take the survey, and they fall into more of a damage category or emergency as evidenced by the name. So with all of these respondents, we got very widely varied results, as you can see from this little screenshot. And we used Excel to analyze several percentages of the ways that people had ranked the attributes. So looking for the ones that were most highly ranked core, most highly ranked useful, etc. We also broke it down by which attributes had the most unanimous votes, which attributes were the most highly contended, and which had the most comments related to those attributes. So we looked at it several different ways and ultimately came up with quite a few key findings that really shaped our views of what to do with this information. It was somewhat different than how we had felt going into it. Some of the comments that were really important and stuck out to us were things like people saying that many attributes in our list were not necessary for basic inventories. Maybe some kind of tiered approach or an inventory with multiple levels would be helpful. Some people wanted to really focus on transportation infrastructure, and we're wondering if there was a way to rank attributes that needed to change over time. So is there a way to look at culvert maintenance and somehow incorporate that into a database? So all of these key findings led us to really rethink the approach that we had been trying to take with this survey. And ultimately, we thought that a relational data model might best encapsulate all of these different comments and ideas and allow people to edit data and upload it in a way that would be useful to as many different types of organizations as possible. So this slide shows some example tables that we've created in a conceptual relational data model, which is different notably from a flat file model in that it has a one-to-many relationship within the different attributes. So each culvert, as shown in the culvert table, would have the culvert index value that would be unique. So the culvert index would then relate it to every other table so that people could see all of the data for a conceptual culvert depending on what was collected for it. And then the other tables that you can see, so environmental data or hardware data related to the physical structure of the culvert, those data would be separated out into tables based on the categories that we've seen people kind of sort things into via the survey or through expertise. And the tables would each have their own ID that would relate back to the culvert index, but would also include the other variables that people could collect if they were interested in that data. Notably, you can see that the hydro and inspection tables include a culvert index SEQ, which would be a sequential index that would allow for multiple visits at one culvert to be recorded as separate data. So you could see, oh, this culvert was doing okay last year, but this year it really looks like it's being overfilled. So maybe this culvert will need to be upgraded eventually to a larger size. So we're hoping that something like this would allow people to incorporate the idea of maintenance or recurring culvert visits into the data. And you can also see in this table that there are different views that a user could query to only see the part of the data that they are most interested in. So one of the main takeaways from our survey was that many people are not really interested or able to engage with 160 different attributes every time they are collecting culvert data, understandably so. And we really wanted to allow people to only see what they want to see. And if they're only going to collect very basic information, that information can still go into this database and be queried and viewed through the different tables. So these arrows just show an example of somebody who is linking the tables together to see certain aspects of the data, which are highlighted. And yeah, Genevieve, if you would like to talk about this a little bit.
Yep. So with this model, one of the main things we wanted to do is have the ability to export and import various types of data so that it can be part of a larger ecosystem and more available to everybody. So one of the main things is having the maintenance and storage environment optimized for multiple COP users. And then also this provides the ability for them to do querying and analysis. And so there are, as you can see, there's like multiple ways to access and add or pull data using the map interface, data input and ingest, using a data analysis, like either in Excel or any other format, and then outputting the data, whether to ArcGIS Online or any other sort of file system.
Exactly. So we really wanted to work with all of the other ways that people are currently using culvert inventories and not work against those things or require additional work from people. So we really want to be able to include all the other data sets and databases that are already out there and really use this as a collaboration tool and a way to kind of bring a lot of different varieties of data together into one easy place to store them and maintain them. So with that, we are going to move on to the second portion of our little WICDI update section. And Emma is going to take the floor for a bit to talk about what she's been working on.
All right, thanks, Melanie. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about some of the analysis we've done around culvert vulnerability, or CulVul, as we've been calling it. Next slide. So ultimately, what we want to be doing is develop some way to predict when and where events like this will occur. So we know there have been a lot of flooding events in northern Wisconsin, and we want to know which culverts are most vulnerable to being destroyed in these events. And typically this is done using very complicated hydrological models. And that's really important and really critical for when a culvert is being designed, to know how big it should be and what the specifications of that culvert should be to be able to pass the amount of water that we expect will occur with rainfall events of various sizes. But it's also a lot of work to go through those sort of detailed modeling studies. And so what we're trying to do is to develop kind of a simpler methodology to just determine which culverts are most likely to be destroyed in a rainfall event. Next. And so we're doing that using what we're calling physical catchment descriptors. And so what this means is that once we identify our culverts, we actually want to define the catchment area for each culvert. So just as an example, on this slide here, we're showing 3 culverts, which we've labeled A, A1, and A2. And here you can see that A1 and A2 are upstream of Culvert A. And so their catchment areas are actually contained within the catchment of Culvert A. And you can imagine that you can see, with this sort of small scale just example that I've shown, it's about 1 mile across. You have these 3 culverts, but then in a larger watershed, you could have many of these nested culvert catchments. And so then once we define the catchment area for each culvert, we then want to extract these sort of physical characteristics of the catchments. So you can go to the next. And so these would include things like the slope of the catchment, the various soil types that are present within the catchment, the size of the catchment, land cover that's present, and then also the stream length within the culvert, or within the catchment for each culvert. Next. And so once we've extracted those physical catchment descriptors for each culvert, we can then try to relate those variables to observations of past damages. So in this case, we could use observations of damage from the 2016 floods. And ideally, what we're trying to do is to basically answer the question of whether there are particular physical catchment descriptors that can explain and sort of predict whether or not a culvert was damaged in 2016. Next. And then ultimately, once we have established those relationships between the physical catchment descriptors and whether they were damaged in the past, we can then use the physical catchment descriptors to predict the probability that a culvert will be damaged in the future, which in this situation is kind of how we're thinking about vulnerability. Next. But first, we need to actually get hydro-enforced DEMs for this area. In order to define those catchment areas, we need to make sure that we actually have a good representation of the watershed that we're looking at. Next. And so this means that we need to find the culverts. And of course, we could do this by going out into the field, but we want to at least start by using existing culvert inventories and also remotely sense data. And this is particularly valuable right now when fieldwork is particularly challenging. Next. So one way we can do this is using high resolution aerial imagery. In this image here, you can see very clearly that there's a culvert in this location. So if we can see a culvert on that imagery, we know that there is a culvert there. Next. But sometimes the aerial image is just a little bit harder to see. And so here you can see like maybe there's a culvert there, but it's a little bit hard to tell. But we do have data that's previously been collected, these existing culvert inventories that indicate that there is in fact a culvert in this location. And so it's those two different lines of evidence. The idea is that we can kind of see something that looks like it might be a culvert on the image, and that we have a data set that tells us there's a culvert there. We can be pretty confident that there is in fact a culvert in this location. Next. And finally, we can just look at the DEM. So in this example, the red areas are a higher elevation and the blue is a lower elevation. And so you can see pretty clearly that there is a road and then there's a stream that crosses that road. And you can even start to see a little bit on that DEM some of the culvert features, such as the inlet and the outlet. So again, we can have pretty high confidence that there is a culvert in this location. Next. And so those are kind of the different ways that we can identify culverts from those data. But what we really need is a process for going through and knowing how we actually identify the culverts and when do we have enough to say that we have a good hydro-enforced DEM. And so we're working on developing a workflow, which we're showing here, for how to go through that. And this is based off of the ACPF toolbox. So starting with the LiDAR data, we can create a bare earth DEM, and then we can hydro-enforce the DEM and look at various derivatives of that hydro-enforced DEM. Things like the flow accumulation raster, the flow direction, and flow lines, and those can give us some indication as to whether what we've done kind of makes sense and if this DEM has sort of been adequately hydro-enforced. And so if we're done, then we can create the stream network and catchments and move on with our analysis. But if looking at those derivatives, we feel like something's still slightly off, then we kind of have to keep going. So next. And this is when we enter this sort of iterative process where we look at the bare earth DEM, we look at the high resolution aerial imagery, we include existing culvert databases, and we try to identify where the culverts are and create actual cut lines in the DEM. And so with that feature layer of the cut lines, we can then create a hydro-enforced DEM, look at those same derivatives, and again evaluate whether or not we are done with the hydro-enforcing, or if we need to continue this iterative process. So this is kind of our methodology for trying to hydro-enforce the DEMs. And the idea is once we have these good hydro-enforced DEMs, we can move forward with the vulnerability analysis, and we'll have these DEMs that can be used for a variety of purposes in this region. Next.
So some of the next steps for us at WICDI, since we've been working on both of these Culvert data models as well as Culvert vulnerability workflows, are bringing the model database into reality. And we've been exploring different avenues for that, different database sources and things like that. So if anybody has any suggestions or questions about that, we will have time for questions at the end of the session. And we also have been, in this time of quarantine and virtual meetings, been exploring a series of shorter virtual workshops rather than day-long or even half-day workshops, where we meet with our community of practice for just an hour or two and talk about one specific issue. So that has been something we've been really interested in, and we're currently sourcing ideas. So if anybody has a topic that they would really like to explore with us further, that would be something you could ask about at the end of the session as well. We also are looking into collection and upload tools that would go hand in hand with our database, and are looking into things like Kobo Toolbox and other open source tools that we've heard about. So those are some of the things that we've been exploring as a team during these last couple months. So I hope this session was informative for you guys, and I am going to pass it off now to our next panelist, which will be the Northwest Regional Planning Commission. So I just wanted to say thanks again for attending, and I'll be back at the end of the sessions to give a little closing. So thank you guys, and Jason, let me know when you're ready to go.
I am ready to go.
Sounds good.
All right, so the slide that you see up on the screen right now is not the project that I'm going to be talking about. However, it is an impetus for the project that I'm going to be talking about. So let me highlight, we're here to talk about an EDA-funded project to conduct a road stream crossing, i.e. culvert, inventory and assessment across the 4 counties of Northwest Wisconsin's Lake Superior. That's, again, Ashland, Bayfield, Douglas, and Iron. But the slide you see in front of you is the Northwest Wisconsin Flood Resiliency Study, a project we completed back in 2016, also funded through an EDA grant proposal or grant project. Please, next slide. So back in 2016, we were approached by EDA to try and identify a resiliency-focused, economic development-focused project in flood-affected communities across our region, and that is those coastal counties. Presidential disaster declaration was put in place after subsequent floods, 3 of them within a 10-year period, caused some pretty significant damage along the South Shore, and also washed out Saxon Harbor, which was the largest marina on the Wisconsin side. What you see in front of you are some of the statistics that came from that regional flood study showing the losses by community. Next slide, please. And here is just a spatial example of the devastation that we experienced in the 2016 flood occurrence. There's 2 other data sets, but I wanted to highlight this one because it was particularly damaging, and it encompassed a very large swath of our region, which is a 10-county region. But you see the predominance of those points, those red points in particular, meaning roads and bridges that were impacted in those 4 coastal counties, and in particular, a high concentration within that Marengo Bad River watershed of Ashland County. But there's a belt that runs kind of across those 4 counties that was dramatically impacted, impacted by flooding. And a lot of these issues were culvert washouts. Next slide, please. And this shows the road impacts that were directly tied to those culvert washouts. So the red sections are roads that were closed for some point in time. A travel disruption was put in place. Either the road was closed because it washed out, or traffic was diverted along another roadway to compensate for us, or compensate for it. One of the major problems we did experience during the 2016 flood, and also the previous floods, was disconnection. Communities that became disconnected from one another. Access to resources became very difficult. From an economic perspective, this was particularly challenging for businesses, having lost part of their client base because of accessibility, but also supply chains were cut off, not to mention the fact that emergency response was compounded by the fact it was difficult just to get around. Next slide, please. So in the 2016 study, we looked at 4 primary types of impacts related to the flood. Obviously, the structural part of that equation is one thing. Public infrastructure being another, things like public utilities, wastewater, and overflows into Lake Superior. Health impacts, obviously. We had loss of life in these events. We had injuries in these events. And then transportation system impacts. And that's probably the category of impact that was most widespread, most long lasting, and outside of the health impact, probably one of the more devastating. Next slide, please. So the infrastructure assessment piece of the 2016 flood study was to look at, as best we could, given the modeling software that we had available and the data that we had available, what some of the potential impacts on our infrastructure systems would be due to a flood event of a 100-year and a 500-year magnitude. We used HAZA software to conduct a level 2 analysis to look at flood depths across the 4-county region, and then cross-reference those damage depth, cross-reference those flood grids with known locations of our infrastructure. Because the software didn't allow us to actually conduct an analysis, we had to make some estimates about utility systems, roads, culverts that could be impacted due to a flood. Next slide, please. And so what you see here are the road stream crossings across actually a much broader area than that 4-county region. But the ones in green are the crossings that where we didn't assume there would be a particular challenge due to flooding. The ones where it's categorized as red, that showed a flood depth grid at 10 feet or greater at the intersection of that roadway and that stream. Now, does that not necessarily mean that that would be a problem, but it could be. And in fact, a number of those points that you see in red are points that also had washouts in the 2016 flood event. So this slide really gets at the heart of where we went from here. We were approached in 2019, again, by the Economic Development Administration to come up with, again, a resiliency-focused, economic development-focused project related to this region, Northwest Wisconsin. And in particular, we had to focus on the 4 coastal counties because those counties were, again, part of a presidential disaster declaration. So thinking about our earlier project, the flood study, and thinking about these road stream crossings and the number of discussions we had with communities, with counties, with emergency managers, we just realized there was an incredible lack of information about these crossings and about the role that they played in a disaster event and in recovery. So we very quickly, we did not have a lot of time to work with, we put together an application to EDA to actually inventory these sites, to visit these sites, to conduct a risk assessment at each one of these sites related to factors like what if it failed? What if we lost this site, we lost connectivity? What does that mean in an economic context? What does it mean in a socioeconomic context? Next slide, please. So this shows the culvert in what we assume be as culvert locations. These are based on photo interpretation. And again, it's showing the depth that the flood depth grid was giving us at each location. A very high concentration in those 4 coastal counties, although it's spread across our entire region. So we knew that this was something that we needed to get more information on. Working with each county, working with local units of government, we tried to get a feel for what information was actually available related to road stream crossings and culverts, and found out it's a complete hodgepodge. It's a mix of just about everything you can imagine under the sun. It's in different formats, some spatial, some not spatial, some written on the back of napkins, some in Excel spreadsheets. It comes in every form you could possibly imagine. We really wanted to take this information, consolidate it, get a snapshot in time, which would be today, 2020, of what these crossings look like, what relative degree of risk they pose to the community and to the region, and what types of improvements might be necessary to bring these things up to standard. So we did craft that application to EDA, we submitted it, and we were awarded funding early this year in 2020. Of course, about the same time the bug hit, and consequently our project has been not on hold. We've been doing a lot of work internally on that, and I'm going to transfer it over to my coworker Clem Larson here in a second to just give a brief overview of that. But we are working on a plan to move forward in the summer season here with field work. So with that, I am going to turn it over and hand the chair over to Clem Larson. He's our GIS specialist here at Northwest Regional Planning.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Clem Larson. Could I have the next slide? I'm going to go through a little bit of the how now that Jason's gone through the why on the process for our culvert inventory. Next slide. This map identifies culvert locations that we identified in the flood study using the Agriculture Conservation Planning Framework tool, the ACPF tool from USDA. These culverts are color-coded in this map by the roadway in which they cross. The red ones being US Highway, the orange ones being State Highway, yellow County Highway, and green being local roads. These are the culverts that we're going to attempt to inventory over the next couple of summers. You can see there's a large chunk in the middle. That's all national forest. The National Forest Service is conducting their own inventory. So we're not going to have to get those ones. So it'll save us a little bit of work. Next slide. The data will be collected using an abridged version of the Michigan DNR's Great Lakes Inventory Method. They developed a really nice Survey 123 app for collecting this data. And we're going to use that too, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Next slide. We plan on collecting the data in the field over the next few summers. So that's our time frame. Next slide. Regarding what we're collecting, we're going to look at physical characteristics of the culvert. That includes, the type of culvert, where it is, what it's made out of, what features it has. Next slide. And we'll also be collecting data regarding the stream that the culvert allows flow through. We're going to be looking at flow, bankful width, perch height of the culvert, scour pools at the outlet, that sort of thing. And we're going to look at any issues that may be limiting the functionality of that culvert. Next slide. We'll also be recording road data, surface type, size of the road, the condition of the road, and the alignment and skew of the culvert as it relates to the roadway. We're still kind of in the planning phase of all this, working out the nuts and bolts, but we're excited to get this work started, and hopefully it'll be easy for local units of government to replicate using Survey 123, so they can, after we develop this original data, they'll be able to go out and update it as need be. And that's all I've got. Thanks for your time.
Okay, this is Jason jumping right back in here. I did want to add that we are working right now with the Forest Service, Department of Natural Resources, a group out of Michigan that is actually designed a protocol for collecting road crossing information. And we're putting together our protocol with the idea that what we create will be replicatable, perhaps to serve as a future standard for other efforts like this, but it's something that that we've got to explore in a technical context a little bit more than we have at this point. We hope to be in the field, maybe working out some of the issues with the equipment here shortly once things dry out. And that's kind of where we're at. So it's a project that's evolving, and we will keep you posted. So thank you.
Thank you, guys. So next up, we'll have Wisconsin Emergency Management.
Okay, can everybody hear me all right so far?
Sounds good to me.
Great. Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Cody Kamrowski, and I work for Wisconsin Emergency Management. Could you advance the slide, please? Perfect. Originally, I used to work in the public assistance section within Wisconsin Emergency Management, and now I work in the hazard mitigation section within Wisconsin Emergency Management. And I'm going to talk 406 mitigation, public assistance, and recovery in relation to the FEMA program. So could you advance the slide, please? Okay, so first off, what is mitigation? In definition to FEMA, mitigation is the effort to reduce loss of life and property by lessening the impact of disasters. And there's several different criteria that FEMA uses, and we will talk about it further. Next slide, please. So a lot of people have worked with different FEMA programs. So there are two different mitigation programs to keep in mind. So there is the 404 program, and then there's the 406 program. They're named very similar, and it is easy to get confused. So first, I will talk briefly about the Section 404 mitigation, which is Hazard Mitigation Grant Program Funding, so HMGP. And this pertains to generally county hazard mitigation plans, and this also relates to the strategies and the goals highlighted in those plans. And this 404 funding is looking at undamaged elements. So you're looking at items that didn't have anything to do with the disaster, but you're looking at proactively acquiring grant funds to address it. What I'm going to talk about mainly is the Section 406 program, which is public assistance mitigation. So this applies to damaged elements in a disaster declared area. So we're talking about, say, Northwest Wisconsin in 2016 and in the 2018 presidentially declared disasters. We're going to be looking at, say, a culvert blows out, a bridge blows out. We're going to be figuring out ways to recover that site and also implement this 406 mitigation funding into it. And this mitigation funding can be included into that project worksheet, which is the recovery document that's created. And to look at 406 mitigation, there's three different rules. There's the 15% rule, which is anything, say you have a project that's $10,000 to repair, anything that's $1,500 or less should automatically be implemented on that if it's eligible. And then there's also the 100% rule, which you could ultimately double your recovery site location price. And then there's also a benefit cost analysis tool we can use to further kind of explore options to beef up that site. Next slide, please. So I'll talk a little bit more about what is eligible under the public assistance mitigation. So when it comes to culverts, realigning culverts to address how the stream is flowing, or relocating it, upsizing it, or putting head walls on that culvert is always 100% eligible. FEMA generally doesn't let people know that, it seems like, but they are 100% eligible, and addressing any culvert inefficiencies that a jurisdiction has when it's blown out should be a top priority. Also, a highly kind of promoted idea is erosion control. So you're talking various gabion baskets, riprap, geotextile, and I'm also beginning to explore bioengineering. I've found some FEMA narrative that goes into the bioengineering realm, but I'm still trying to learn what is and is not acceptable. And then just stabilizing roadways, elevating equipment, or trying to flood-proof buildings and structures are also eligible items. But again, this the 406 mitigation pool is only used on areas that are damaged. So culverts, bridges, buildings. Next slide, please. So also, I like to mention this because I was pretty much unaware of it when I walked into the program. But there is also improved projects and alternate projects. So when you have, say, a culvert blowout or a bridge blowout, most people are under the assumption that they have to repair that site back to exactly what it was the day before the storm hit. That's not necessarily true. There's other avenues you can go down. So the first is improved projects. So you can kind of cap the funding with FEMA. So if you had a culvert at a location, but you want to put in 2 culverts or a bridge or do something entirely different, say a low water crossing, you can do something different. But what FEMA will do is cap the funding at what it was to repair it back to pre-disaster condition. They'll cap it at that funding amount, and then you're given a little bit more leeway on what you would like to do at that location. And then another kind of project that I like to address is alternate projects. So you're essentially walking away from the recovery of that site and you're spending the money elsewhere. So an example would be the Douglas County Highway Department, or Douglas County Forestry Department. So the Cranberry Creek Dam in 2018 blew out, and the county was able to pursue DNR grant funding to essentially eliminate that dam and restore that area back to its natural ecosystem prior to that dam. So they addressed the recovery of that site, but they didn't receive or take FEMA funds to rebuild that site back to what it was. Instead, they were able to take those funds and buy a dump truck, actually. So in areas that it can make sense, this is an option that I have worked with on a few different projects. Next slide, please. So it's a beautiful picture from the Wisconsin Wetlands Association. Everybody's probably seen this a few times. But say a storm does come through, you have damages, now what do you do? These are just a few little tips and tricks I give all of my local communities I work with, so they're able to walk in and hopefully be a leg up to make sure they're able to get the necessary funds they need. So next slide, please. So a few key items is you need to advocate for yourself. So if you would like mitigation, you have to be the one to spearhead it and take the initiative to do it. FEMA is overwhelmed. They're kind of, they like to come in and leave pretty quick because there's disasters in every state. It seems like all year round. So they're pretty busy. So having the local applicant or the township, village, city, county, having them take the initiative and kind of advocate for themselves, I would say is the best advice I could give. And then too, at the end of the day, you are responsible for yourself. So there's measures various jurisdictions should do, such as saving all of your emails and correspondence with FEMA or Wisconsin Emergency Management or your county emergency manager. Next slide, please. So say you do have a storm that comes through and you have a culvert that blows out and you would like to upsize it through the mitigation program or the 406 mitigation pool. There's one thing to note that FEMA has been relatively inconsistent with throughout the United States, and that is requiring hydrology and hydraulic studies, so an H&H study. So if a culvert is being upsized, FEMA will require a H&H study if it is located within the special flood hazard area. And you can go on FEMA and kind of pop up the maps and see if that culvert is located in that special flood hazard area. Say it is not located, you want to upsize that culvert and it is not located in that special flood hazard area, you do not need to do an H&H study. But if it is, then an H&H may be needed. But say you're working with your Department of Natural Resources staff and they deem an H&H is not needed, generally what they need to do is provide a letter of justification with maps, drawings, and calculations to show that some thought was put into this and they've come to that conclusion for XYZ reason. Next slide, please. And one other huge tip that I love to give when it comes to not only mitigation, but public assistance in general when it comes to FEMA is developing and getting estimates. So FEMA doesn't, how the program operates is they don't really care what you envision at the end or for your estimate. They need to see what dollar amount it is to return your damaged area back to what it was the day before the storm hit. That information is needed no matter what you are doing. It's used as a foundation and you can build from there. Say you don't want to do what was there, or say you have a 4-foot culvert that was blown out and you have no intentions of putting it back in there, that's fine, but you will need to get an estimate to show how much money it's going to cost to bring that back to what it was the day before the storm hit. Once you have that estimate, then you're able to develop further estimates. You're able to have one with 406. You're able to do an improved project with a bridge. You're able to kind of have all your different ideas put out there, but you have to have a side-by-side comparison with the pre-disaster condition estimate. This generally, it's hard to grasp because why would I create an estimate on something I know I'm not going to do? That's just one of the nuances of the program that people need to be aware of. Okay, next slide, please. And I like to call this the calm before the storm, just because there's a lot of things jurisdictions and counties could be doing right now in preparation of the next FEMA event. As we know, it's going to happen. So what can we do at this point to prepare for it? Next slide, please. So I've worked with a lot of the communities affected from the 2018 Northwest Wisconsin disaster. It's called DR 4383. And right now there's about $9.2 million obligated in category C through G projects, which is essentially public infrastructure projects. And out of that 9.2 million, there's an additional 73,000 in mitigation costs. Now that number is 0.8%, which is minute compared to the amount of funding that could and should be there. In FEMA best practice is supposed to have they're supposed to write in the 15% rule, 100% rule, or use a benefit cost analysis. So that means ideally we should be hovering at $1 million in mitigation for Northwest Wisconsin. Instead, we have $73,000. When I was working on these projects, I was realizing that most projects didn't have any mitigation, or if they did, not near the amount that they should have included on these projects. And I wanted to figure out more reasons as to why. So could I go to the next slide, please? So what I like to do with communities, because a lot of these communities throughout the state, they're pretty stretched thin on their resources. They have their clerk has 10 different jobs or 10 different roles. And so I wholeheartedly understand that everybody is stretched thin. So for this planning exercise, I try to kind of be aware of that. And so say your entire community is hit with 10 inches of rain. What 5 to 10 locations or sites would face the most damage? So think about that. What 5 to 10 structures are the most vulnerable within your community? Then I would like you to rank those by priority so you can look at the traffic flow, whatever commerce, how many people are affected, kind of whatever criteria you want to do to establish that. But then I want you to acquire and organize as much historical information as possible. So I'm looking at past damages and costs, because FEMA will come back and ask, have you had historical damages or costs on this? And then the last suggestion I would have for this planning exercise would be to develop a plan. So you can get quotes and estimates and this will help you envision what you'd like to do in the future. Next slide, please. And then the last big thing I would like to talk about would be maintenance records. So in order to get mitigation dollars tomorrow, you have to keep maintenance records today. So documenting pictures, receipts, documentation of costs, all of that is critical. If you would like to get mitigation dollars, you have to demonstrate you've incurred prior costs. So tracking that is absolutely critical. It's a pain, but it will pay huge dividends in the future when you want mitigation dollars. So next slide, please. And here's my contact information if you need to get a hold of me. And then also, if you want to dive into some more FEMA policy, you can look at the FEMA Public Assistance Program and Policy Guide. And within that, there's Appendix J, which is the 406 mitigation section, which is all the policy pertaining to mitigation and public assistance. So thank you, everybody. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach me.
Thank you, Cody. And I believe that next up we have Wisconsin Wetlands. So Kyle, let me know when you're ready to go.
I'm ready. Next slide, please. Well, thank you, Melanie, and everyone for the prior presentation. So I'm Kyle Magera. I'm with the Wisconsin Wetlands Association. I'm our local government outreach specialist, and I'll be talking about some of our work in the Lake Superior Basin, or those 4 coastal counties that everyone referred to earlier. Specifically about the opportunity to build flood resiliency by rebuilding our natural infrastructure and putting wetlands and floodplains and streams back to work. Next slide. Next slide, please. Already covered, but just to impress upon that this area of Northwest Wisconsin has been hard hit by prior floods, and a lot of our interest in ongoing work has been informed by the July 2016 storm. Jason and Clem with the Regional Planning Commission talked about how Ashland County, specifically the Marengo River watershed, was the epicenter of that flood, and you can see just the amount of damages that are in that bold blue line, which is the Marengo River watershed. The green line, our analysis was all using operating at a catchment scale. The green line is the areas that we investigated through a data analysis, field recon, and interviews with different experts to understand what was going on in the wake of the 2016 storm and others, and whether people and experts and local officials were thinking about upstream solutions and opportunities to restore and manage hydrology in better ways. Next slide, please. Specifically in all this work, we are promoting and hoping to demonstrate the concept of natural flood management. It's really aligns well with the slow the flow strategy that has been around in the Lake Superior Basin for years, dating back to the 1960s and the Red Clay Project, and specifically trying to improve water quality, capturing sediment by addressing the velocity and volume of water. Natural flood management, in the simplest sense, is, as the name implies, is putting natural features to work and enhancing their ability to capture, infiltrate, and manage and slowly release water. In particular, the concept is being designed around mitigating erosive energy. It's not just about storage and connectivity, looking at structural solutions, but what are ways that we can utilize nature-based approaches in tandem with other structural mitigation practices, such as armoring the road, upsizing culverts, and so on. Next slide, please. Fluvial systems are complex and dynamic, and with the emergence of LIDAR and other mapping technology, we've really gotten better at demonstrating that complexity and those dynamics that exist in natural systems. There's a lot of articles and neat artwork that has emerged over the last couple of years, and one example out of the United Kingdom, which shows just how much our rivers naturally move across the valley bottom. you'll see examples where oxbows and other side channels are forming within that river corridor. You can see the old historic side channels, and just the mass amount of which our fluvial systems tend to move and naturally want to operate and behave both during low and high flow conditions. Understanding these hydrologic dynamics is going to be critically important if we're going to build flood resiliency and think about ways that we can upgrade our road systems to better handle more water because of climate change and extreme weather events, but also to reactivate and use culvert replacements to reactivate and mimic these natural processes. Next slide, please. What we have, though, because of the way our communities have been developed and the way in which our road stream crossings have been placed on the landscape, we've created static confined systems that disrupt those fluvial or hydrologic processes that I was talking about in the last slide. So in this image, you can see the old oxbow, the meander scars that were in this area, and the single thread channel that is unable to probably interact with those historic features due to the way how the road locks in and really prevents those natural processes from playing out. The static containment of our flow systems exists in many different ways. It exists in wetlands, it exists in streams, and getting back the dynamics and those water level fluctuations and the connectivity that is so important to watershed health will be very important. Next slide. But really, it's all about the energy. What you see as we confine flow, on the upper left, you see an example of a natural system in southwest Wisconsin. Perhaps could be in better condition, but you have a connected floodplain system, which means that it's very easily, when a storm hits, it's very easily able to get out of its banks and interact with the floodplain and the wetlands that exist within that floodplain. So in a connected floodplain system, you typically would have multiple channels, sedge meadows across the floodplain, forested islands, deep accumulation of sediment, and a really high water table. So you have an enhanced or a high level of surface water and groundwater connectivity. What happens, though, because of land use change, excessive flows because of the storm events that we're seeing, you tend to get a fire hose effect, or the channelization of our stream systems. So you get a conversion of sagebrush. This graphic is from out west, so it'd be more conversion of shrubs or to forest, a lowering of the water table, and more intermittent stream flow when you create that canyonated V-shaped channel that conveys flows very quickly downstream. When you have a culvert with these conditions upstream at a catchment scale, that's going to put an immense amount of pressure downstream on the culvert itself. Next slide, please. When that happens, you get a down cutting or a channel incision process that happens. So when the flows are confined and become channelized, whether intentionally or unintentionally because of land use change, you get that down cutting process, which further disconnects the floodplain. And as you lose headwater, wetlands, and other natural features that hold water back, you get the deposition on the landscape and you get the entrenchment effect, which further disconnects those floodplains. If we do not address floodplain disconnection, we're never going to be able to disrupt and mitigate that erosive energy. Next slide, please. Please hit the text. Oh, I guess I lost some text on that other slide for whatever reason.
Sorry about that, Kyle.
So basically, when we have alterations to our headwater features, and our headwater wetlands, those upper portions of the watershed, the combination of head cuts and gulling, you see one example in the image, the culvert in the lower portion of this image, and head cutting that's working its way upland into the upstream wetlands that exist. And that combination of head cuts and ravine erosion and gullying creates the loss of storage and disconnections. So disconnecting those headwater wetlands and contributing to that floodplain disconnection process that I was talking about earlier. Sorry about that slide. Next slide. These features that I was talking about, there's new methods which FEMA actually accepts and will embrace as part of risk and vulnerability assessments. States like Vermont, Colorado, and Indiana are some of the first states that have developed this program. But what typically they're done for regulatory purposes. But in the Lake Superior Basin, we're proposing to expand this methodology with a combination of different partners to identify where are the occurrences of gulling, incision, head cutting, floodplain disconnection, or really where those natural erosion and deposition processes have become hazardous, specifically to identify where we can do strategic hydrologic restoration on the landscape. Next slide, please. This work, because it is a new approach, and the idea of natural flood management is not widely implemented yet. We're working with quite a bit of different partners to develop the assessment protocol and to develop the technical assistance that can help communities implement these types of projects. The Northwest Regional Planning Commission will be leading the GIS analysis and the mapping and assessment components, and working directly in Ashland County, where the Marengo River watershed, the area that I was referring to earlier, where that is located, and developing an approach, a locally led approach for dealing with building flood resiliency, but also a multi-objective approach where opportunities to improve water quality, fish and wildlife habitat, and so on. Next slide, please. The FEH study will be funded by the first ever FEMA pre-disaster mitigation grant that's designed to focus on hydrologic assessment and the identification of natural flood management projects. So a nature-based approach in ways to complement some of the structural mitigation practices that Cody talked about earlier. Running in parallel to this, there's some new funding created through the 2019 Act 157, which will allow the creation of demonstration projects. So using both the assessment through that FEMA study, and I can take questions on the methods after if there are any, but the FEMA study will be helping to identify where are the priority areas on the landscape where hydrology has been degraded, and where can we create and scale up, both in terms of demonstration projects, but where those degradations are common and widespread. The idea is to create a new proof of concept in Ashland County that can then be exported to other communities across Wisconsin. Next slide. Specifically with the FEH study, we will be expanding the assessment methods and utilizing the road stream crossing method that you talked about, that was mentioned in a couple different places. But the idea is not only when we're looking at the vulnerability of the crossing and looking at that contributing drainage area, but what are the different steps you can take in an analysis to look upstream and look at the condition of wetlands and floodplains. What's the rate of incision, those gullying, and is that properly captured in the assessment method or our current data sets? The focus again will be on prioritizing and scoping where natural flood management projects can occur. Next slide. With that, we'll be utilizing the Great Lakes Road Stream Crossing Method. Jason and Clem talked a little bit about it, and they have a geo database and survey 1, 2, 3 forms already created, and have expressed a willingness to work and expand and include in the FEH method and other field assessment forms that are typically used by USGS and other scientific agencies. But the idea is not only where can you improve fish passage, but when looking at the culvert, are there opportunities to utilize grade control or other protective measures that can help reconnect the floodplain, lift the stream up, set the grade, and discourage the head cutting or those erosion processes from occurring. Next slide. The integrated protocol is in, we're currently in about the second or third phase of soliciting technical feedback. We're working actually with a consultant that out of Vermont who helped develop one of the first FEH programs. But basically, we'll be focusing, expanding that Great Lakes road stream crossing method to look at the extent and severity of hydrologic disconnections, looking at ravines and gullies, the extent of stream flow alterations, establishing a set of fluvial erosion hazard sensitivity factors that will help with identifying at-risk catchments, and then cross-referencing that to the amount or extent of vulnerable culverts and bridges, and then creating data that can then be used in FEMA's benefit cost analysis to help communities both with the documentation, but also to navigate the grant application process to submit competitive projects for nature-based approaches. Next slide. So with that, thank you for the time to present. This work is all ongoing. The FEMA Advanced Assistance Project in Ashland County is just launching. The protocol that's in development, I hope, will inform a lot of the work with our different partners, and hopefully be set as a template potentially that can be used in other communities. But there will be lots of lessons learned, and I hope it will be refined and available and useful for tapping into and unlocking FEMA and other hazard mitigation money for watershed restoration projects. So thank you.
Thank you, Kyle. And next up, we will have Jeremy from Outagamie County. So Jeremy, let me know when you're good to go.
Thank you, Melanie. So I have been asked to give our county case study of our culvert inventory. It basically started 7 years ago when our collector came on the scenes, and we had, for the first time, a quick way to go in the field and collect, with GPS and tie it back to our enterprise system. If I had a crystal ball, I would have waited for survey 1 through 3, because I feel like that's really become the #1 used app that we use for collecting features similar to culverts in the field for other work that we do. So I work within the Land Conservation Department, and we have a simple need to keep water moving downhill in our GIS analyses that we run. However, our highway department is who we wanted to really take ownership of the project, because they're the ones that manipulate these culverts. They remove them, they replace them, they enlarge them, they maintain them, they need to budget for them, all those different reasons. So we started working with our highway department to see what paper forms they were using, and we essentially built the system for them so that they would then start using the system so that the data stays current as we go along. The models that we like to use or need to use were mentioned, or some were mentioned earlier, like ACPF, but we were also using the DNR's eval tool, ArcHydro, and most recently we completed a water storage capacity need study of the Lower Fox, which heavily relied on knowing where culverts are at in the built world. Next slide. So like Emma showed earlier, this is the DEM. Red is high, green is low. The straight feature going from southwest to northeast is in yellow, and that's a road. Digital dam, sure most have heard of them. And so LiDAR cannot see the culvert, and so we need to identify there's a culvert there and then do our burn line for our analyses that we do. Can you animation, please? So a burn line is simply a vector, a polyline in ArcGIS that we draw using our DEM from upstream to downstream. The DEM is important so that when you start your line, you want to be in the lowest elevation value on each side of the road when you go from one side of the road to the other. This is important just to have a good hydro-correct DEM. And so essentially the programs then take your line that you drew and then they carve a V into the road so the water can keep flowing from high to low. And so our work process is to find out there's a culvert, and once we know there's a culvert, we identify it with our app, and I'll show that soon. But then we still have to do the work in the office to draw a line across the road, the digital dam, to make our models work well. So next slide. So the orange boundary is Outagamie County. Brown County's to our east. We do a lot of work in the Lower Fox River, and that's the Blue River on the right side of the screen there. But we wanted to, I guess the first step was to just identify where streams cross road center lines. To us, that was a simple starting point for the highway department to go out and start identifying attributes. So the red dots are the relics of that analysis, and those red means they have not been inspected. But we're 99% sure there's a culvert there because that's where the stream crosses the road. The green dots are culverts that have been visited that are road center lines, and the blue dots are culverts that have been visited that are driveway culverts. Any fill placed where water drains is considered a dam, in GIS analysis. So we have to know about the driveway culverts and the road center lines. Next slide, please. There's a lot of culverts in the built world. Our workflow is, before COVID-19, was 2 people in a vehicle, one person driving with hazards on, the other person entering the data. And so you can cover a lot of ground, essentially a whole section in a day or 2 of just identifying, yes, there's a culvert here. Besides just where the streams cross, there's culverts all over the place that cross roads. And the nice thing with the road culverts is they're usually marked by markings that are visible from a vehicle. Driveway culverts are just as important, like I mentioned. So the person entering the data is just essentially clicking on the iPad, left, right, or when it's a centerline pipe, they click to create that feature. One thing we did for the highway department, the highway department has to do a lot of things with culverts. They have, like I mentioned earlier, they got to replace them. They got to do drainage studies. And so the highway department, as shown where the object ID box is here, they're taking pictures of the culverts as well because they want to know what they look like from the office. They also we set it up so that when they apply for a permit, they have all the photos that they need for submitting a permit without having to go to the field to get that. Additionally, the highway department utilizes the WISCOR system and survey grade GPS, and they shoot in the inverts of the pipes and they denote more like towards the beginning of this panel discussion on all those attributes that are important. If it's got a state ID, if it's got a federal ID, all those different things that were on their paper forms. So their work involves one crossing might take them 10 minutes to over half an hour to collect all the data and do the work they need to do to have a robust system. Whereas in that half hour, we might have collected, 100 crossings. So very different, but at least we know the culvert's there and it can be visited again in the future for all those other great attributes should we need them. Next slide. So this is current features. You saw the original map of the county, maybe 25% of the county's done, and we have 3,000 road centerline pipes that we've seen or came across. For the road centerline ones, if we have time, we are trying to at least measure and know the type of shape it is, because those tend to be bigger drainages and they might impact a future study. But for the most part, we like the 4th line there. We just want to know that it's there. Next slide. driveway culverts are order of magnitude 2 to 3 times more driveway culverts than there are center line crossings for us. Just as important for routing water through subdivisions and in urbanizing areas to get accurate watersheds to some of these center line pipes, but the only thing we really want to know is they're there. And permitting systems, which I'll touch on here shortly, are the primary driver we want to use for getting information on those. So for this COVID-19, when we were told that we are essential but not to report to the office, one thing we decided to do was essentially take a job of 1 or 2 people within the department and educate the whole department on how to collect culverts quickly using their phone while out for drives, social distancing. So the northeast corner of our county is where we've gotten the most data collected since being out of the office. But essentially we wanted to, to me it was neat that we roped everybody into it now, not just for a watershed analysis, but it told me that eventually if we need to collect a lot of data, we could put out some type of a public format for people to enter the data for us. And then if it becomes critical for engineering, we may still have to visit the site, but 90% of the data has been collected by, say, the general public or all these other municipal workers that are driving around on the roads, even utility contractors. Not sure what it would look like, but I just think we just opened our eyes to really anybody can tell us there's a culvert there and a couple of the simple things about it. So next slide. So next steps, like I said, selfishly, we just want to know there's a culvert there. So we are currently working in the Lower Fox TMDL implementation to clean up the surface water from non-point pollution. The Upper Fox and Wolf TMDL just got approved recently. So the other 2/3 of our county is going to require a lot of the same analyses we've run over the last 5 or 6 years for the Lower Fox. So we want to see countywide coverage. That's something we can control and something we can collect pretty rapidly. Ideally, though, we're going to get full adoption by the highway department. So every time they do a culvert replacement or they permit a new culvert, they're entering them into the system so that we don't have to keep this timely, or not timely, but time intensive driving around trying to find culverts. So utilize our permitting systems to start entering in the new ones and any replacements. The next level is the town or local road. So if the town is replacing a culvert or permitting one, we'd like to create that public facing data entry point so the town can be that data entry person, because they're the ones that are approving the culverts and allowing them to go in. We have to keep finding them when our surface models say there's a dam. And then regional integration. Water, unfortunately, our counties were set up how they were set up, and watersheds do not follow county boundaries. So our Lower Fox project involves 4 counties, technically, with Winnebago County, Calumet, and Brown. But when we start working in the Wolf River watershed, we're going to have 14 counties of data and models, and water comes from other counties and comes through our county. So I really think regional integration, and that's why this project is exciting for me, because you can, if everybody's using the same, at least core features, the systems should be able to talk to each other. The next slide. So I'm always happy to talk about culverts and runoff modeling and GIS analysis. Here's my contact information if you want to reach out with any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy. So, I thought I included one more slide at the end, but I guess I didn't. Well, thank you again to all the panelists. That was really informative, and hopefully our listeners got as much out of it as I did and the WICDI team. I believe we will be having time for questions after this, but in the meantime, I would just like to say again, thank you to everyone for attending.